Super. Thank you very much, Dean, for inviting me, for enabling me to be here to celebrate in person Peter's birthday and all his fantastic philosophical achievements of a lifetime, and looking forward with all of you to more from Peter in the decades to come. Yes, Peter is smiling. I am not a student of Peter. I met Peter during my first year as a graduate student, in the first months, in fact, of my first year as a graduate student when he was giving the Gifford lectures in St. Andrews. And I think I relate to Dean's experience of feeling a bit terrified and not knowing what to do in front of Peter, but then deciding, well, I could go up to Peter and just talk and ask a question. And that was the moment this long-standing friendship, if I may say so, started with Peter when I discovered that, yes, Peter is a great interlocutor, philosophically speaking, but he has lots of other topics he's happy to talk about, lots of warmth, and I feel very, very lucky for that encounter and for that long-standing relationship with Peter. So thank you, Peter, for all these years of interactions. So I am going to talk about a question, a topic that is dear to Peter from a slightly different angle from all the ones that have been explored during these days together. I want to ask the question of what is the number of a thing. And I want to say that we, generally speaking, modern philosophers, bestow oneness upon things quite liberally. We bestow oneness upon things liberally in the sense that we hold that at least some things are one. And we further hold that a thing that is one can have parts. And here I'm going to relate some of the things Peter has written, for example, in Material Beings. In certain circumstances, which are under the special composition circumstances, Peter says things add up or compose something, and unity arises out of plurality. And in other parts of the book and even previous work, Peter is quite explicit that this kind of composite, that is one, has parts. And this case is the case of life. A living being is one, and it has parts. But I want to and bring to this audience a different perspective. I want to say that Plato and Aristotle, and generally the ancients, would say that it's impossible for a thing that is one to have parts. If a thing is one, it has no parts. And I want to raise the question, why did he think this way? I want to imagine a dialogue, if you like, between Peter and Plato and Aristotle and see what each of the two sides would say. The ancients, I think, would say that if a thing is one, it has no parts, because they are committed to a principle that was introduced by Plato, but actually endorsed by Aristotle, and interesting, a principle that neither of them actually feels the need to justify or explain, so they treat it like an axiom. And this is the principle that I call the number of an object principle. It's in that enormous handout that I circulated, but I thought it would be helpful to keep track of all the things I want to say, particularly because I'm taking you to territory that may not be familiar to you, and also because as an Italian, I speak English as fast as an Italian speaks Italian, so I thought, holding on to a long handout might help. So this is the number of an object principle. Simply stated, the number of an object is the number of its proper parts. So this principle seems to fly in the face of a mainstream view of composition today, which is that things can be one and have parts. And I think Peter would endorse that principle of today, but also others in this audience. The ancients would just say no. Either the constituents of a composite are parts of it, and the composite is many, or the composite is one, and its constituents are not parts of it. So the composite has no proper parts. And again, the interesting question is why. So this principle explains why they would deny that something is one as parts, but then why do they hold this position? And even if this was not surprising enough for us Mariologists and metaphysicians interested in composition today, I want to say that the ancients are even a bit more radical than that, and they would hold that nothing is just one. Again, in contrast to this position that we find very intuitive today, that at least some things are one. So the ancients, I think, would say that nothing is just one because they are committed to a position which I call here the dualism of oneness. And again, you have it on the handout. Each thing is counted or individuated, according to the ancients, by two mutually irreducible criteria of oneness. And these criteria, as I reconstruct them, are extrinsic oneness, according to which a continuum is one when, roughly put, is set apart from all other things by a limit that is external to it. And intrinsic oneness, a continuous is one when, roughly, is set apart from all other things by some intrinsic criteria. So all that is quite intuitive and quite familiar to us, but it came to be part of the history of philosophy at some point in time. I think the intrinsic criterion we owe it to Parmenides, the extrinsic one to the Pythagorean Philolaus. We're not going into that story now, but Plato is the one who actually begins working with two principles. He puts them vis-a-vis each other, he gives examples, he begins theorizing about them. And then these principles, I claim, drive a lot of Aristotle's metaphysics and creates this interesting contrast between this ancient view of composition and today's. So the overall argument that I want to build here on behalf of the ancients is that on account of this dualism of oneness that I see in their systems, the number of a thing for them is one and many if a thing is a composite, or one and one if a thing is not a composite. And my aim here is to reconstruct the position, reconstruct the arguments behind this position for the ancients, to give a deeper understanding of central issues in ancient metaphysics, but also to motivate discussion among contemporary metaphysicians around this question of composition and oneness, which has been dear to Peter, is dear to many of you here as well. So, starting with Plato. I said that both Plato and Aristotle are committed to this dualism of oneness, but I think it's fair to say that both of them are more interested in working out the metaphysics of intrinsic oneness. That is more interesting to them rather than elaborate or go deeper into extrinsic oneness. And for both of them, I would say the big preoccupation is to make sure that their primary substances, their par excellence substances in their respective ontologies are one by intrinsic oneness. So that's where the arguments focus for them. Of course, substances are very different types of entities for Plato and for Aristotle respectively. For Plato, these are the properties that he reifies in ontology, the so-called forms. For Aristotle, substances are physical entities like this table, myself, the cat, and the tree. Now, let me just, before I go into how both Plato and Aristotle try to argue that their substances respectively are one by intrinsic oneness, let me say one thing that might be helpful as a methodological note. So I'm working here with ancient philosophical text, and I want to say nowhere in this text we find stated some of the claims I'm attributing to the ancients. It's not that simple for us interpreters of ancient texts. So what I think I can say is that we find arguments, both in Plato and Aristotle, that make sense only if understood as problem-solving arguments with respect to a position that they assume. So when I say they hold this dualism of oneness, when I say that they hold that a composite is one and many and an incomposite is one and one, I'm not claiming that, I open Aristotle's metaphysics and there I find it as a claim made there. I'm rather saying there is a lot going on in.
Your battery wore out.
Can you hear me anyway?
I think you can keep
okay.
speaking.
Right.
I'll
Okay, cool. So I rather want to say that there is a lot of problem solving going on in this text that makes sense only if understood as aimed at solving difficulties that would arise for this position that I call dualism of oneness, and particularly, as we're going to see, for this idea that both Plato and Aristotle want their substances to be one by intrinsic oneness. So I'm going to start with a series of problems that Plato discusses in his own work, which are problems that he, I think, understands as problems, potential problems for the idea that his substances are one by intrinsic oneness. Thank you. I feel empowered again. Plato wants his form to be one by intrinsic oneness. He assumes that they are, but he also wants to allow in his ontology what I call plural forms. These are forms like the form of two-ness or the form of equals. These are forms that maybe are the equivalent of contemporary structural universals. We can explore that. The idea for Plato is that these forms, he refers to them in the plural and in the many. They are one and many, so if they're one, they have no parts. If they're many, they have parts. What's the ontology behind all that? And I want to claim that this is where we find an interesting, innovative way of thinking for Plato. When I say innovative, I think, of course, I mean it's innovative in relation to whatever was going on before Plato, but it's innovative, I think, because it brings some different way of thinking that is different from today's ways of thinking as well. So Plato talks about this issue of how something that is many can also be one by means of some examples. His examples are the number 6 and the syllable so, composed by the letter S and O, in one of his dialogues, De Theaetetus, in the so-called dilemma of composition. And in relation to the number 6, he has a little exchange between Socrates and Theaetetus, which I have on the handout. Socrates raises the question, is there any difference between all in the plural and all in the singular? For instance, if we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and if twice 3, or 3 times 2, or 4 and 2, or 3, 2 and 1, are we in all these forms speaking of the same or of a different number? Of the same, says Theaetetus, that is of 6, yes. Then in each form of speech we have spoken of all the 6, yes. And again, do we speak of one thing when we speak of all of them? Assuredly. That is of 6, yes. Then in all things that are made up of number, i.e. all composite things I add there, we apply the same term to all of them in the plural and all of it in the singular. So here I see Plato as claiming that the number 6 is one and it is many. But he does not actually explain why. So it's a statement to this issue of the dualism of oneness as I see it, but there is no actual explanation of why this is the case. And that's where I come in with the hypothesis that this is because he's counting the number 6 in 2 different ways. So he counts it by extrinsic oneness and by intrinsic oneness as a collection of units individuated each by extrinsic oneness and as one on account of the nature of the number 6ness. And this is individuating the number under intrinsic oneness. But if this is the case, if the number 6 is supposed to be a general example for something that is one and many, then Plato owes us some account for what happens to the constituents of this composite when the composite is individuated as one, and per the number of an object principle, it has no parts. And Plato obliges. So just a little later, we find Plato explaining that, now speaking about his other example, the syllable so, something that is made up of constituents is one because it is unified, he says, by an indivisible form into a partless whole. I think I gave you the lines on the handout. He says the syllable is not identical to the letters, but a single thing, a single kind of thing that is arisen from them, having a single form of its own, different from the letters. So I understand here Plato saying that something constituted from different constituents or components becomes one top-down, individuated by this indivisible form, which makes its oneness intrinsic to it. And being one, it has no proper parts. And that fits. Plato just says a little later, if the syllable is not the letters, does it not follow necessarily that it contains the letter not as parts of it? It does. So the position here that Plato develops is that the thing as one is constituted from components. It has arisen from the components. It is unified by a single form partlessly. But how does this happen? What's the metaphysics behind it? And further, and I think it challengingly, why does the complexity of such a thing does not result in its plurality? And that's where Plato leaves things at. So we don't get any further metaphysical explanation of how things are. So it's all very embryonic at this stage, but I think the question is being put on the table. So I kind of endorse Alex's sympathy for that remark that we could think of the history of philosophy as a series of footnotes to Plato, but not quite. I think Plato puts the questions on the table. Aristotle is really the one who drives the development of a lot of metaphysics to give answers to this question. So that is one of the problems that Plato faces with plural forms, a problem that extends to all forms. How is it that if there is any sense in which forms are constituted or composed, they're one and many? Yes, there is something that unifies the many into one, making it partless, but how does that happen? But that's not the only difficulty or potential difficulty that Plato sees for his commitment to forms being each one by intrinsic oneness. The other potential challenge that Plato identifies is that for something to be unified by this single form, it has to be that form. And he explicitly says this in relation to the syllable. He says the syllable or combination is a single form. So I take this to be a requirement he set for things that are unified by intrinsic oneness, that they are whatever makes them one by intrinsic oneness. But then Plato begins to wonder, what if the thing itself were not what makes it one by intrinsic oneness, but instead had these unifying forms predicated of it? So if that were the case, it would be a subject essence, in Aristotelian terms, division, such that the thing would be made one by something that belongs to it, is predicated of it, maybe essentially predicated of it. But for Plato, this would be just enough to open up an ontological rift, if you want, a gap between subject and essence, such that the form would not any longer be one by intrinsic oneness, but would have components or constituents, using the term broadly, subject and essence. And Plato responds to this hypothetical worry by stating that his forms are each one kathauto. This is a Greek expression that has been very central to debates about the nature of Platonic forms. And here I offer as an interpretation of it, different from the one of other people, that what Plato is simply saying is that the form is whatever makes it what it is. So, so as to block this potential worry that there is a subject of which what it is to be is predicated, and that would undermine the oneness by intrinsic oneness of the forms. So the expression, as I say, it's unfamiliar to us. Kathauto is not something that we actually say. It's nothing like essential predication. It's just a way of saying the form is what it is that makes it one. And so there is no worry to be had about any potential plurality of components within a form. Now, interestingly, I think for us, there is a further problem that arises within Plato's metaphysics for his idea that the forms are one by intrinsic oneness. And this is a problem that actually Plato does not diagnose himself, doesn't offer any answer to. But it's really interesting because the problem that arises from the fact that I think Plato was the first to discover the idea of recurring universals. Maybe you heard this before, but let me say what I think is my twist on the story. He did discover recurring universals, but did not ontologize them in his ontology. So for him are part of a thought experiment that doesn't lead him to posit them, but if he had posited them, that would be certainly a challenge for the oneness of his forms. So the thought experiment in question is what I called the third bad argument, is not the third man argument in the Republic, where, very briefly put, Plato imagines two forms for the same property. So two forms standing for the same property in this case is being a bed. And is thinking that there needs to be something that makes these two forms qualitatively identical, and this is the form of a form. Again, I imagine it is not something you heard before, Plato positing the form of a form, but that is just quite explicitly what he says in that argument, and he repeats it actually in other texts like the Timaeus, so there is strong evidence this is the case. But now if a form is made to be what it is by the form of a form, you see that his initial worry that forms are not one by IO, by intrinsic oneness, because there is a subject of which the essence is predicated, resurfaces, and resurfaces in a challenging way. And Plato has here no awareness of this problem, maybe because he doesn't really reify the form of a form, it's just exploring a thought experiment. But what is really fascinating in this story is that although Plato doesn't worry about this issue, doesn't pursue any solution to this issue, I claim this is really the beginning of Aristotle's theorizing about the oneness of substances. So my big picture claim is that much of what Aristotle has to say about the oneness of substance gets started by these issues in Plato, in particular the idea of a form that makes the form what it is. But Aristotle, like all of us, is a philosopher in progress, in development, and he starts out as a pupil of Plato, and at the stage when he wrote the categories, is actually really Platonic. So like Plato, he wants his substances to be one by intrinsic oneness. Remember, his substances are physical entities, and he thinks of them as constituted by, exclusively by properties. So interestingly, just at the opening of the categories, we find this sentence that I think makes sense only with the background I gave you, where Aristotle claims and then repeats later in the categories that when we spoke of things, i.e. properties in a subject, i.e. in a substance, we did not mean things belonging in something as parts. So the way I read this is simply, Plato is just kind of following Plato, Aristotle is following Plato, says, for my par excellence substances in the categories, I conceive of them as constituted by components or constituents that are not parts of the substance, because if they were part of the substance would not be one, but many. So just let's clear the ground. I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of Aristotle. Whatever makes up the substance, i.e. the properties that make up the substance, are not in the substance as its properties. And again, so Plato speaking, I think, here. So if the constituents are not in the substance as its parts, then Aristotle is home. He can think of his substances as one by intrinsic oneness. Recall that Plato was thinking that this unification of the unification of the components in a partless one depends on these unifying forms that unifies the components bottom down, and that's precisely what Aristotle too posits, and that is the substantial form or the species form for those who are familiar with that language. So for example, being a human being for Socrates. And again, so far is Aristotle following Plato. But Aristotle takes a step forward, I think, beyond Plato in a claim that is quite puzzling as it stands in the categories, where he says it is clear, and that is one of these cases where Aristotle is clear, but it's not clear at all to us reading the text, that for things, i.e. properties, which are in a subject, i.e. in a substance, in most cases, neither the name nor the definition of the property is predicated of the subject, i.e. the substance, i.e. Socrates. So notice that I think what he's saying here is that we shouldn't buy into Plato's account of participation of objects in forms if that account is such that the property as in the substance is such that the name and definition of the property applies to the property in the substance. So here, just to make it a bit clearer, I'm thinking, so Plato, in his late account of participation, thinks that if a thing partakes of a form, say of justice, and resembles the form, then the name and the definition of the form would apply to the thing that is just. And Aristotle says, no, that can't be. There must be some sense in which the property, i.e. the form in Platonic terms, in the substance is in the substance in a different way than when it's not, when it is not instantiated, we would say. Yes, indeed, this should be the case, given that the property is not part of that substance. But again, that's the end of the story as far as the categories go. We don't get an explanation, an account, a philosophical explanation for how the properties that make up a substance are not parts of this substance and are not definitionally similar to the property, and yet they qualify that substance. And that's the beginning, I think, of the big project of Aristotle's metaphysics, which I see as in large part about addressing the question of why the constituents that make up a substance are not parts of a substance. Recall that Plato had just gone part of the way to address this question. Recall that the categories just give us this hint that when the property or qualifications of a substance are not in it as parts, we're in the need of understanding what's the difference then between being a part and being a qualification of a substance. And I claim, and I hope this will be particularly of interest to some of you working on these issues of composition and oneness, that Aristotle draws a really interesting difference between being a part of a substance and being a qualification of a substance. And the difference, as I see it, is that for Aristotle, parts depend only for their function on the substance they are in, while qualifications depend for their individuality and numerical oneness on the substance they qualify. And so what's the difference and what does it mean, metaphysically speaking? To explain it, let me just quote what I think is the key sentence of Aristotle in the Metaphysics, this is Zeta 1, where he says that in the definition of each term, i.e. predicate, i.e. red, for example, which stands for a property, the definition of each substance must be present. The way I understand this sentence of Aristotle is that the definition of a qualification of a substance includes in it the definition of a substance itself. So the idea is that the definition of a substance, which is embedded in the definition of a qualification, gives the qualification the same individuation criterion of the substance. So a red strawberry is not red plus strawberry for Aristotle. Redness in a red strawberry is not individuated as a color, but rather as a qualification of a strawberry. That is a point that is very important to me, a point on which I'm really seeking your feedback as contemporary metaphysicians. I think this is embedding of definitions in definition is a really interesting idea of Aristotle. It's what is going to work for him as the mechanism, the metaphysical mechanism that allows him to go up to some point in accounting for the oneness of substances, not all the way though, as we will see. So the contrast between parts and qualifications of a substance is that the functional parts are defined in terms of the function the substantial form gives them. Say these lungs depend on the activity of life for their function, but not for their number. Qualifications, by contrast, depend for their number, for their oneness on the substance of which they are qualifications. Now, suppose that this mechanism, suppose you are with me and with Aristotle, suppose that this mechanism actually works in the case of substances like the substances of the categories, which are made up only of properties, for delivering the oneness by intrinsic oneness of the substance, the oneness by IO. Does a substance that is one by intrinsic oneness also have a number by extrinsic oneness? As the number 6 for Plato was 1 by IO and many by EO. Is Aristotle really pursuing the project that Plato had set him kind of off pursuing? Yes. This is beyond the categories. This is in the metaphysics where, as it is familiar, I'm sure, to all of you, Aristotle begins to address the problem of the generation of things. And states explicitly a commitment to the Parmenidean idea that nothing can come ex nihilo, no new substance can be created according to Parmenides and Aristotle following Parmenides, because something would have to come from nothing. It is impossible. But then generation is a common phenomenon in nature, so what's the solution? And there's matter. This is the discovery of matter in ancient thought. So Aristotle's solution to the problem of generation is that every new substance is generated from matter that already existed, and therefore no substance is created ex nihilo. Good, yes. So it is a change from the categories. In the categories, as I emphasized, his substances are physical entities made up only of properties. And there, Aristotle doesn't think about his generation problem. It's just not present to his mind. There is no matter, there is no thinking about generation. But once Aristotle does discover matter, then various issues come up for him and for his thinking of the number of things. So each substance now, as I will argue in what follows, turns out to be one by IO, intrinsic oneness, on account of the substantial form, and one by extrinsic oneness on account of its matter. And now every substance for Aristotle is going to be one and one. So the substantial form itself, constituted by as a structure universal, we could think, is 1 by IO, matter is 1 by EO, the substance is matter and form, so substance now is 1 and 1, just to repeat. And then matter, as the subject of which the substantial form is predicated, or the substantial form belongs to, now gives rise to that ontological division that was worrying Plato at the beginning between a subject and the properties, the essence that make it be what it is. And Aristotle is going to try hard to bring all this together and to argue that substances are actually each one. But this is something new, I have to say, and different from what I said in the past. I think it fails, and I think it's going to be interesting to see why, again, for our thinking about composition. So first of all, a little argument for why I think Aristotle thinks that substances are also one by extrinsic oneness on account of the matter that constitutes them. On his biological account of generation of a new human being, which is kind of gruesome maybe, but the menstrual fluids of the mother, informed by the movement encoded in the father's sperm, become the flesh and bones of the embryo. So here is the important point. At some level of abstraction, the same quantity of matter that was in the mother comes to be now the matter of the embryo. And the new substance is therefore not created ex nihilo. Now, the important point for me is that that quantity of matter that survives through the process of generation of a substance from another substance, so offspring from mother, is one by extrinsic oneness, because it's only circumstantial which specific amount of fluids from the mother come to be the matter of the embryo. It's contingently individuated, that quantity of matter. It's extrinsic historical circumstances. And this just fit the bill for being something that is one by extrinsic oneness. So now the substance is its matter, but the matter of a substance is individuated by EO. So now the substance is 1 by EO as well as being 1 by IO on account of the substantial form. The problem gets diagnosed in one of Aristotle's perhaps more debated text, the so-called stripping away argument in his metaphysics, that's Zeta 3, where the key line, as you have it on the handout, is that given a substance, all other things, i.e. properties, are predicated of its essence. Here read substance for essence, but the essence is predicated of matter. So the important point is simply that Aristotle discovers here there is an ultimate subject of predication of a substance. Of all the predications of a substance, all the properties that are what the substance is are predicated of an ultimate subject, which here is identified with matter. But now the subject is something on which everything else is predicated, so it is other than all these properties. And this otherness opens up that ontological division, that rift that Plato initially was worried about, then had kind of solved with this cat-out-toe idea, but that then comes up in Aristotle's metaphysics with great metaphysical force for Aristotle. And Aristotle takes the problem really seriously, but tries to assess how much damage it's going to make for him. In a different argument, the regress argument differentiates cases. So he says, okay, there is a sense in which for everything there is a semantic subject, but that's not a worry. It's only when the subject is ontological that the worry arises. So for essences or substantial forms, we can still hold Aristotle thinks safely that they are one by intrinsic oneness. There is no ontological division between subject and a form. To put it differently, substantial forms are cut out of what they are in Platonic language. But in the case of substances, this is not the case, because the subject is an ontological one. And so there is a real division between subject and essence, and crisis on for Aristotle. So now the substances that he really wanted to be one are not one. They are one by intrinsic oneness and one by extrinsic oneness. Problem, big problem for Aristotle. This is a problem that I think really drives a lot of Aristotle's thinking, and I don't have time or space here to go into all the ramifications of the problem for him. But I want to say that there is something interesting that happens in the metaphysics. So Aristotle appears to say that he has a solution to the problem. And I want to say most of us readers of Aristotle has kind of believed that he has a solution there to the problem that he's facing. And I too have done that, thinking that yes, in this last chapter of metaphysics, the metaphysics book Zeta, Aristotle has it. He has a solution that many actually so-called neo-Aristotelians have endorsed. That solution comes in what is known as the syllable argument. Again, syllable examples comes back, was a Platonic example you may remember. So here Aristotle says, well, something that, this is an example that's been picked up by lots of contemporary metaphysicians, just to mention one, Catherine Kozlicki. So there Aristotle says, yes, if you have a composite made up of elements, whatever unifies that composite cannot be a further element because that would be regressive. It needs to be something else. I call it principle, says Aristotle, or arche. That is that serves as a unifier of the substance. The nature of this principle, as I said, has been debated. It ranges from Grand Priest, thinking of it as a gluon, to Catherine Kozlicki, to lots of other interpretations that have been given. Here, I just want to limit myself to say, yes, this is the idea that there is a unifying form, but with a twist. So now Aristotle calls it principle because he wants it to do something about the components of the composite. What is it that Aristotle wants it to do? To implement that metaphysical mechanism, as I called it, to embed definition within definitions. So if that worked, I emphasize, then yes, the substantial form could unify the substance by somehow embedding the definition of by having the definition of the substance embedded in matter. And then we would have the whole substance, matter and form, unified as one by intrinsic oneness. And that would make Aristotle very happy. And if that was the case, in fact, it would be fair to say that Aristotle is the father of modern functionalism. So let me throw this in. I think that's what many have taught, that Aristotle has a solution for the oneness of substance, the form of operating somehow on matter, that would make him a functionalist. That's not, however, I think, workable within Aristotle's system. Why not? Why am taking a different position than most and myself in an earlier embodiment? Because the matter of a substance extends, I want to say, beyond and before the substance itself. What do I mean by that? The quantity of matter that makes up me as a substance now was the quantity of matter in my mother, and will be the quantity of matter in my corpse when the time comes, hopefully in many decades to come. But the point is that, so this quantity of matter in me cannot become a qualification of me. It cannot be transformed from being a part to being a qualification. It's not mine, in a sense. It was my mother's, it's going to be my corpses. And that's why this mechanism of assimilation that Aristotle had found for unifying elements of a composite cannot apply to it. And further, the matter, the quantity of matter that makes me up or makes up a substance is always set apart, delineated, demarcated by historical and contingent circumstances, and therefore cannot be subsumed under a type of substance. So now the crisis is really deep for Aristotle. So here's a substance that is made up of matter and form. Matter is one by extrinsic oneness. Form is one by intrinsic oneness. There is no, Aristotle has a mechanism for turning the components of something into its qualifications, but that turns out can apply only to the form, which yes is one by intrinsic oneness, but cannot apply to matter, for this idea that matter extends beyond an individual substance. And so the solution, what has been thought to be a solution in Metaphysics Zeta 17 does not work. And that is where the real problem of allomorphic unity of a substance arises for Aristotle. And I want to say it's not solvable by Aristotle. But before I come to that claim, I just want to say Aristotle does make one more fresh start, one more valiant attempt to solve it, which I think also proves that he didn't really believe that his solution in Zeta was the solution, because otherwise we would not have tried again in the following book in the Metaphysics Eta. So what happens next in Aristotle's thinking? Well, let me first clear the ground from the possible idea that some have had, and here I'm gesturing, for example, at Kit Fine's work on this topic. Aristotle is not thinking of matter and form as parts of a substance. He cannot think of them as parts that he can kind of sum up under a total number. Why? Because the arithmetic of oneness by intrinsic oneness and oneness by extrinsic oneness is different, so there cannot be a third type of oneness. They both are. Rather, I think Aristotle is really creative and is going to try again to apply what I call a mechanism, a metaphysical mechanism of embedding definitions in definitions. Let me just tell you how I think he tries to do it. So it's going to try to say that, okay, let's think of matter as potentiality, and let's embed the definition of the substance of which matter is the potentiality of in that matter. So to kind of paraphrase his words, he would think along these lines that in the definition of matter, there is already the definition of its substance, but in potentiality. And if that worked, that would be a way of embedding the definition of a substance in the definition of something that would become its qualification, namely its matter. And you have the text on the handout, is where Aristotle says, well, people look for a unifying formula. And we want to say, well, you, Aristotle, were looking for a unifying formula, weren't you? Between potentiality and actuality. But actually, as we have said, the proximate matter and the form are one and the same. The one existing potentially, the other actually. Therefore, to ask the cause of their oneness is like asking the cause of oneness in general for each individual thing, i.e. substance is one, and the potential and the actual are in a sense one. Thus, there is no cause, thus there is no problem, Aristotle wants to say. But here is my objection to Aristotle. I think he's thinking of physical powers, physical causal powers, like we would say magnetism. Yes, a physical power like magnetism is essentially defined by the type of power is essentially defined by the type of exercise or manifestation or actuality, if we want to use an Aristotelian term. But there is no counterpart to that type of power as a metaphysical power. So there is nothing like the power of the wood to become this table. It just doesn't work that way. The wood can become a table, a statue, you know, a ashtray, maybe not if made of wood, but yes, you see what I'm saying. So I think where we are now in this analysis of Aristotle's thinking, despite interesting, innovative, creative, worthwhile attempts to look at, to have substances to be one by intrinsic oneness, which is very important to both Aristotle and Plato, Aristotle has no solution. What has been able to do is to argue that the substantial form is one by intrinsic oneness. But he also has matter in a substance, and matter is one by extrinsic oneness. And there is no way Aristotle can operate on that extrinsic oneness through the substantial form to unify the substance. This is not to say that matter and form are parts of a substance. Again, I want to emphasize that because lots of Aristotelians take that view. I don't. Matter and form are just substance as one by intrinsic oneness, one by extrinsic oneness. So there is kind of hybrid oneness here. And there is no way to bring it into something that is one by single criterion of oneness. So I'll just, let me just recapitulate what I have argued so far and try to draw some conclusions that hopefully will also latch on to Peter's ideas and some of you, your thinking about the issue of composition. So my starting point was to note that there is a very different way of thinking about composition and oneness in present days metaphysics from ancient metaphysics. And that in itself, I think, is very striking. So I wanted to try to understand why the ancients, who are philosophers we think highly of, were so different from us in thinking about these issues. And I've been trying to reconstruct what I think are the general theoretical positions they hold from arguments we find in the text. But again, I said, look, these ancient people did not write like us. So there is a lot of problem solving that goes on in their text, which makes sense only if we understand that problem solving for certain problems they felt they had. And these problems arise if they had certain assumptions. And here are the assumptions that I think they had. That this dualism of oneness, namely that each thing is individuated under two different mutually irreducible criteria of oneness, intrinsic and extrinsic. And having these two criteria motivates both Plato and Aristotle to think about their substances, how to count them. But interestingly, it's only intrinsic oneness that really turns them on somehow. Fair enough. So they both try to develop their metaphysics in such a way that Platonic forms and Aristotelian substances are one by intrinsic oneness. They don't care about the other part of the story, extrinsic oneness. At least Plato certainly does not. Plato says, OK, my substances, my forms can be one by intrinsic oneness. Why? Because although they're made up of components, they're unified by a form that top-down unifies the components in such a way that they are not parts of the form. Fine, but we don't have any explanation of how this happens and why this complexity of the form does not yield multiplicity many as opposed to one form. Aristotle, I think, takes on the challenge. So, of course, substances for him are a different thing. They are physical entities in the categories, material entities in the metaphysics. And as long as Aristotle thinks of his substances as physical entities, he can endorse Plato's approach to the oneness of substance by saying, yes, substances are made out of properties. These properties are unified by a form. But beyond Plato, Aristotle can say, oh, I have a study for how this happens. The substantial form transforms the properties in a substance from parts to qualifications. So I'm speaking metaphorically here when I say transforms. But what I mean is that the definition of the substantial form is embedded in the definition of the properties that qualify that particular substance. And that is what explains why the properties are in the substance as qualifications, but not as parts. And that is something on which I seek feedback, because I think it's an interesting idea to explore. Beyond that, Aristotle then discovers matters. This opens up a different problem for him. Now he has a substance that is its substantial form, but also a substance that is its matter. And so now a substance is what I put in terms of one and one. It's one by intrinsic oneness insofar as the substance is its form, but it's also one by extrinsic oneness insofar it is a quantity of matter. And Aristotle tries in different ways to solve that problem. He has been interpreted as having found a solution to the problem by having the substantial form re-identify maybe matter and all the parts in such a way that the substantial form bestows oneness upon everything that makes up the substance, properties, and matter. But I'm saying that cannot work. Why not? Because the quantity of matter that makes up the substance goes beyond the individual substance, from the ancestor, if you want, to the successor, in the sense of the corpse of that particular substance. So Aristotle can't do it, and he cannot treat matter and form as parts, contrary to what others have taught, because there is no third oneness that can serve as the total sum of these onenesses, because these onenesses are, if you want, incompatibly, one in incompatibly different ways. So substances for Aristotle can only be some sort of hybrid of two different onenesses. That's where the story kind of ends in relation to how the ancients have taught about composition, partness, or oneness. But I want to say that's not what my conclusions are going to be overall. I want to try to make relevant this different position of the ancients to what we're thinking today in metaphysics. And I did try to spell it out, in fact, on the final page of the ginormous handout I gave you, what I think may be of interest today in relation to ancient positions. But there are a couple of things I just want to say orally before concluding. So I think there is a really interesting assumption, maybe intuition, or assumption in these ancient thinkers that parts somehow carry oneness, carry their number to the composite of which they are parts. So if something has parts, that thing is many. That seems to me, and I again seek for your feedback, to be something that Lewis would feel as driving a lot of thinking about composition. So the manyness of that Lewis worries about is, the manyness depends on the parts. Why? Because the parts carry their oneness. And Aristotle tried very hard to eliminate these parts from something that is one. Parthood, rather than composition, determines the number of the thing. Maybe that's a better way to say what I want to say. That's what I think there is in common between these ancient thinkers and some of contemporary thought, of which I think of Lewis as a representative. That parthood, rather than composition, determines the number of a thing. So if something has part, it's going to be many. And there is no way composing the parts in some way by some metaphysical relation. And here I'm also including holism as one such type of relation, would not deliver oneness. If something has part, it's going to be many. There is nothing that is going to connect the parts, nothing that is either holism or gluons or various types of relations that contemporary metaphysicians have tried to bring in, that is going to make the part become one. If there are parts, they have the number is what determines the number of the composite. So if this is the case, I want to turn to Peter, and I just want to say, allegedly Peter claimed at breakfast with Richard that he has written all he wants to write with respect to metaphysics and philosophy in general. But I want to say it would be fantastic to have another paper from Peter telling us how we can think of a living being as one and having parts, maybe straightening up what the ancients think, maybe taking that into consideration, maybe giving arguments against what the ancients think. But there is a lot to discuss, and I hope in the years and decades to come, Peter will give us more on the topic. Thank you very much.
Well, Anna, thank you so much. There's a lot here, not really my line of country. I would, when I hear this question, or the question, can something be one and yet have parts? First I'll say, what does it mean by something being one? Well, I don't think they mean that something is one just in case the number of things identical with it is one. That wouldn't rule anything out. I mean, everything has that feature. I sort of thought of a song from Between the Wars. It goes, "You're so much a part of me, the two of us are one." So you can think of the parts of a thing all singing together. We are one, I guess. I think that's the idea of a thing being one, and that's really the question. Then I think the question becomes, can there be parts that you can have a lot of things arranged, say, table-wise. Could it be that they compose anything? And the answer is no. So, I mean, it seems that this is really just a statement of nihilism, except, of course, in the sense that, say, Jonathan Lowe would be a nihilist, where you have extended, simple, some of even us, or our bodies or something. They don't have parts. And that is rather an Aristotelian picture. I know nothing about Plato and what Plato says about this, but it does seem that Aristotle thinks we're extended simples, albeit ones that exchange matter with our surroundings and are made of matters, but we don't have parts. It's an interesting point of view. It just doesn't speak to my condition.
That's an interesting comment. I mean, yes, it is. Look, I very much appreciate the sense of otherness that you may get from my talk. Yes, it's another country. Yes, it's another language. But it is philosophy. And I think there is something really interesting in being confronted with a really different point of view from antiquity that can make sense to us. We may find it different, we may disagree with it, we maybe argue against it. But what I want to say is a point of view that needs to be taken into consideration because it's a philosophically interesting point of view. It may be not your cup of tea or not your country or not where you want to be, but all I'm asking you is to take it into account. And so in response to your suggestions, Peter, I do not think this is what E.G. Love would think about substances. I don't think that's I don't think Aristotle would think of substances as E.G. Love was thinking about them. I think Aristotle, really contrary to what many Aristotelian scholars and contemporary philosophers thinking about Aristotle really taught, is that substances cannot be unified. He wanted them to be unified. He wanted to have the oneness of substance, whether for living being as paradigmatic cases, or maybe even artifacts in a lower way, lower degree of unity way, but he can't. And that is the iconoclastic conclusion that I'm trying to bring, among others, to this discussion. So he would not agree, I think, with you that the living being is one. He would like to be one, but he doesn't have a way to make it one. Why not? Because as long as something is composite, and that is composite of abstract or physical parts, as long as something is composite, for Aristotle there is a problem in having it to be one, two. Why? Because for him, and here is a strong position, okay, and so I'm happy to hear this agreement. For him, as I see him, there is no way relations can unify something into oneness. So that's what I was trying to say. Parts have their own numbers. Partood is what gives the number to something. So if something has parts, it cannot be one. And there is no, I think it's testimony of how the debate is going also in contemporary metaphysics. How many proposals there are on the table for explaining the oneness of substances? The range is enormous. I mean, Jonathan has a lot to say on the topic too. I mean, but it seems to me that at least from the perspective of the ancients, no relation can unify the parts into one. The only way this can be done is from vanishing the parts, metaphorically speaking. So how does vanishing of the parts happen? Well, in the categories where the parts are properties, the trick is to transform these properties from being parts of the substance to being qualifications of the substance, which happens by embedding the definition of the substance in the definition of a property. So it's like being sighted as opposed to having eyes as parts of the substance. But this works only for properties. Once matter enters the picture, I think it's game over, really, for Aristotle. And so, I mean, to put it more positively towards you, Peter, what I'd be really interested to hear, not necessarily today, but in your work to come, is how is it that the life is one, but has also parts that are causally integrated? How is it, unless this sense of oneness of the living being is a kind of lower degree of oneness in the sense that it's if life is a composite that has all these parts that are integrated, I think we are on the same page. But if this composite is really unified, as it seems you put it in many passages in your work, then I wonder how can it also have parts as opposed to being a collection of many.
The parts do kind of dance.
Yeah.
The life is dance.
Yeah.
The life isn't really an object.
Yeah.
You know, and if they're doing the right kind of dance,
Yeah.
people coming into the dance, people going out of the dance, if it's the right sort of dance, there's one thing there. Now that isn't in the end an explanation of what makes something the case. It's a statement of what I believe to
Yeah.
be the case. As I said, I'm just answering the special
Yeah.
question, not the general, quite general question.
Yeah, but you see, so suppose I invite you to dance and we dance together, that doesn't make us one substance. And so it is a problem with the special.
Right dance.
Even so, yeah. What makes it right?
Nothing can have two parts, let's say, two proper parts, I suppose. But you have to have a vast number of parts.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So we all dance.
Aristotle, Shirley, the author of The Parts of Animals believed that animals have no parts, right? And their qualities, their properties, those are not parts. They inhere in them.
Yeah.
But they're not
Yeah,
parts.
yeah.
So, I mean, that was just what I was saying before. You seem to be disagreeing with me, but I just said Aristotle's a nihilist, and technically speaking, and that he believes that substances and the UCI are really the only things there really are.
Yeah.
I mean, the other things, they're just there in a way.
Yeah.
These are the paradigm beings.
Yeah.
And they don't have parts.
Yeah, so maybe I can be more precise. So I want to say Aristotle is not a nihilist because he thinks, like in the categories, for example, he thinks of substances made out of constituents. So there is composition there. But from these constituents, something arises that is one, and once it arises and it is one, is partless. So there is composition. It's not that there is never composition, but that composition yields the kind of one that, well, I think you would like life to be, and Aristotle at that stage thinks these substances are, but it's not material. It's not a material being.
So, well, of course, part of Aristotle's problem is that he's Aristotelian. So he believes that the properties of things appear in the things, and that makes them in some sense constituents of things. Right?
Yeah.
In another sense, matter is a certain quantity of matter is a constituent, at least in the material substance, but not parts.
Yeah.
But a nihilist isn't somebody who says things have no constituents. A nihilist is someone who says things have no parts.
Yeah.
So that, I said, technically speaking, he's a nihilist.
Right. I mean, yes, okay, we can talk more about this, but let me just say one thing that I hope you find interesting. I think Aristotle's if Aristotle's problem is that it is Aristotelian in the sense that it has properties as immanent or constituent of substances, I want to say that's Plato's problem too. In fact, it's more Plato's problem. For Plato, properties are parts of things. Things are constituted by properties. And I think that's precisely what Aristotle is reacting to when he says, wait a minute, these properties make up substances but cannot be their parts. As to how we can precify nihilism, yes, I think I'm happy to concede that I should make it a bit more precise there. But the thing is that if you ask your special composition question of Aristotle and Plato, under which circumstances things compose in such a way that something one arises from them, they would say never. But that doesn't mean that things never compose. It's just that they never compose something that is one. So that's the point I want to make. Okay, we'll talk more. Well, that makes us an opportunity for us to talk more. Yes.
Hi. I have a question about the framing of the whole argument. Like, my main question is, I mean, my first reaction was like, well, the reason why the problem is I mean, the one versus many becomes like a problem for Plato is because once you have forms in your ontology and you're committed to, connecting complexity, even mirological complexity with change, and then the only reason why I introduce form in a kind of dual ontology is to, grant some kind of principle of unit that explain why we can talk about things as one in spite of their complexity, then the kind of, then the answer to like, oh, why, there is a problem to begin with is because, things in the material world change and are complex, and complexity is incompatible with the kind of stability that we demand from the level of form, and so form need to grant that kind of stability, and so we cannot bring in, let's say, that kind of complexity at the level of the forms. But then the kind of statement of the principle, then like the number of an object, becomes ambiguous depending on what is it, like what you consider an object in the principle. Like, if you think that object refers to something in the material world, then it cannot be one in the sense that we need like this kind of extrinsic level and the level of the forms to grant its unity. But then if object is supposed to range over forms as well, then you can't bring in complexity because forms are supposed to be simple by definition.
They aren't, I mean, sorry, it's a long story, so I'm sorry if I don't pay justice to the length of your question, but this does not depend on any particular conception of forms, and the principle is supposed to generalize over abstract and concrete entities. So it's nothing to do particularly with form simplicity or change or whatever.
Yeah, but that's my problem, in the sense that I do think that, like, Plato would just say, oh no, I mean, like, forms cannot ever be composite. So I mean, if then the question of the talk is like, oh, why is the simplicity a requirement for forms? That's a different thing.
I mean, there are different things there. Plato wants forms to be one. That doesn't mean they cannot be complex. So they're not the same as saying simple. So as I say, I think there'll be a lot more to talk about, but if, for the sake of allowing everybody to ask a question, I'll just leave it there. Sorry.
Thank you, Anna. You covered an enormous amount of material. I hope you don't mind if I also ask you a question that concerns the very beginning and the way you set up the issue. And it's about the number of object principle and the dualism of oneness principle. My worry is different from Martina's, and it is the following. Aren't you worried that someone might peter out both principles on the ground of the simple fact that the underlying logical form is either not well formed or question begging, by virtue of the fact that we seem to be talking about objects, an object, but even if in the plural that doesn't make much of a difference. And so we've got these singular variables that range over single things, and then to ask of those single things whether they are one or many. You see the point, right?
I see the point. I don't know if you remember, we had an earlier discussion on the beginning of this thinking in Columbia. So you raised that worry at that time.
Oh, did we? I don't remember.
I do remember, because you were saying, how can you say the number of a thing? As soon as you say a thing, you're saying one thing, and then how can you worry about it being one and one? So I want to simply acknowledge that, yes, there is a difficulty in speaking about this matter without somehow committing myself to a thing, and then and now raise the question. So is the you've already decided it's one thing, and then you raise the question. But I think maybe a logic can be developed. And that's something I've not done. I recognize what you're saying. As I speak, I already seem to be committed, and then contradicting myself by saying, well, the number is not one. But
well, at least I'm consistent with
my
you
are. Give me time. I'll get to it.
Let me just ask just a quick follow-up. So one way in which the issue has resurfaced in contemporary metaphysics, of course, is the composition as identity debate. And there, again, some people, beginning with Peter, have Peter out the view because it's unintelligible, etc. But in one important sense, I think we should agree that there the question is perfectly well formed. Is the whole identical to its parts? And if you have a language that has plural variables, you can formulate that question in such a way that both answers are candidates. I mean, one of them, according to Peter, isn't, because identity cannot be one, many, etc., etc. But the point is that we have an identity claim. Whereas this way of formulating it, I'm asking then, you think can be turned into that formulation, given a certain thing, one, say, is it identical to its parts, taken collectively? Do you think that's a good way of capturing the intended principle?
I want to take a rain check on this, Achilles. So I think that as far as I've gone with this kind of work is to extract the position from the ancients, and that takes a lot of work, and see it as development within Plato and Aristotle. I do acknowledge the point that you asked me then and ask now, what's the logic that would allow us to speak properly about all this? Is there a good one? I do not know at this stage. So I see the need for that. I acknowledge that. I'm hoping someone is going to take up the project with me and do that with me, and maybe find out there isn't, but maybe find out that there is, and it's different from the logic that we are more familiar with. So I just take the rain check on that. Thank you, Achilles.
I actually have 5 or 6 things. I'll just give you 3 quick comments, and maybe I'll give you the rest afterwards.
Okay, cool, yeah.
Okay, first, your NOP, the number of an object, is the number of its proper parts. You'll want to tweak that somehow, because for Aristotle, 1 is not a number. It's the principle of number. So you couldn't say that a thing that is 1 has a number in his language, at any rate. Second, given that you want to cover Aristotle, you'll want to make a distinction between actual and potential parts in the way you state that.
Yes, I'll respond later. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Then just the third one I'll mention. You're right about the categories containing a statement that substances are partless. But just last night I was looking at a text where he says something like, in the categories, don't worry, the parts of substances are substances. So I don't think he's entirely consistent about that in that work.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I disagree with the seeing Aristotle as inconsistent in the category. So I think he repeats the idea that properties are in the substance, not as parts, a few times, and they're not parts because they are qualifications, because the name and the definition of the property does not apply to the qualification. So I think that. I don't see where the inconsistency would arise in the categories, but maybe you can convince me later. We can talk more later. I do not want to amend the principle because I want to make it a very general principle in a larger picture. I think it's not just Plato and Aristotle that think this way with the NOP principle, principle, and that's why I want to keep it in a way that is independent from the particular ways each of them would phrase it. So I don't worry that Aristotle will not put it that way precisely, and I don't worry about the issue of actually potential parts at this stage, at least that principle. But I'm happy to talk more. So thank you for the points. I wait for the 2 more later. Yeah, cool, thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to express a worry about the argument in section 8.
Yeah.
I should say, before expressing this, that this is 100% informed by my ideas about contemporary metaphysics, so I could very well just be getting everything wrong about Aristotle. I know very little about what's going on there. But the idea was basically that you talk about the principle not being able to unify the matter because the matter extends into the past and the future. In some sense, like the matter is different at one point and different at another point. I guess what I would have thought is that the principle governing, whatever's making the thing one somehow includes these modal principles, right? Somehow is just, is going to give you some rules about counts as the same thing, even though you take away an atom or two, or take away some pieces.
Yeah.
And in that case, that would still be an intrinsic rule, right? If we want to say that, so my thought is that would still count as satisfying intrinsic oneness, because, it is set apart from all the other things by intrinsic criteria. It's just that criteria includes some modal facts, right, about what counts as the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's any particular reason that he can't take that on board, given what he thinks about, the principles and form and so
Yeah,
on.
so thank you. I mean, here, I think a fair answer would require a bit more about matter, me saying a bit more about matter, but here what I want to say in that argument is that the quantity of matter that makes up me, so not the proximate matter, the quantity of matter that makes up me is actually the quantity of matter that was in my mother, and it's going to be the quantity of matter that is in my corpse, will be in my corpse. So in that sense, the form cannot operate on this quantity of matter in me now and make it one by intrinsic oneness, because it's not mine only. So it's not a matter of one or more atom. It's just literally the same quantity of matter that was in my mother and that will be in my corpse.
But doesn't the matter change over time, right?
This is quantity of matter. So I mind the specific definition of quantity of matter, Alan Cartwright's definition of quantity of matter. I didn't go into that for brevity here. So the quantity of matter, which is an abstract way of thinking of matter, is just the same, doesn't change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But thank you again. I hope we can talk more.
I think I'll pass now.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a few remarks on the metaphysics eta argument. I was trying to reconstruct, I don't really know, I was just trying to reconstruct it from,
Yeah.
and it didn't seem as bad to me as you're making out. So the game seems to be, I have to be prior to my constituents, or that's bad for my oneness. And so certain tropes, they're all right because their definition, I'm figuring the definition of the tropes, I'm prior to them, we're still all right. But I'm just trying to reconstruct, but my matter looks like a problem because I don't figure in the definition of my matter because my matter in your lingo extends beyond me.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem like I can enter into the definition. Solution, okay, so we've discovered matter, we've discovered quantities of matter, and we've got a problem because it now looks like there's a constituent of me that I'm not prior to,
Yeah.
that I don't enter the definition of.
Yeah.
I don't enter into the account of what it is for that matter
Yes.
to be. What we say is, as I'm just reading what he's
Yeah.
saying, the matter doesn't survive in the ordinary sense. The matter does not survive. In the ordinary sense, for the matter to survive, it has to survive in actuality. What does survive, there is a kind of survival that happens. There's a power to produce or preserve matter. There were powers to produce and preserve matter when the matter was around in actuality. The matter isn't totally gone from the space of, because when the matter's gone, but there is a particular power to produce or preserve it, in this case produce, that's in me, so that when I die, that power is actualized and you get that very same quantity of matter back. So that very quantity of matter is sort of like, not just matter in general, that very quantity of matter is sort of in play in a certain way because of the power to produce that very quantity. But that hasn't survived in the ordinary sense. And how about that power? I can be prior to that particular power because that's a trope-like thing where I get to enter into the definition of that particular power. And the power is just a physical power. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So the matter isn't around, the physical power is. I don't know, by the standards of the game, it's
Yeah.
sort of ticking along, not so bad.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this, John. Let me just say what I think. So the answer hangs on what quantity of matter is, and so you are thinking. What survives, in some sense, between the matter and me and my corpse is going to be the physical powers
To produce it.
to produce
Not around.
it.
How to produce it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I want to say that what survives is this quantity of matter, which is very abstract type of thing. It's not physical powers to produce it in other circumstances. So what I need to work out is what is it that makes you think that quantity of the way I think of it as quantity of matter, which is very abstract type of entity that survives, very different from the menstrual fluids of the mother, flesh and bone of the embryo, whatever stuff is the corpse. Why is that quantity of matter, you think, the physical power, reducible to the physical powers to reproduce it?
It's not actually around. It's like no coincidence. We've got a no coincidence view. There is no thing coincidentally that is that quantity of matter. All there is the power to produce that
Yeah.
quantity of matter.
So then, so I'll think more about this, but then there is the second strand of argument.
So
and
the Earth is, suppose I'm made out of a quantity of Earth.
yeah,
That Jones is not not in being.
Yeah.
How to produce Jones is in being. That's all there is.
Yeah, okay, but quantum matter is more abstract than even Earth would be. So,
Yes,
yeah,
I
okay,
know,
cool,
I
cool.
know, I know.
The other thing, John, can I just try on you the second strand of argument? That was that the problem with matter as individuated by extrinsic circumstances is just that it can't be subsumed into a type, because what defines that as one are these historical contingent events, and that's an impediment from it to be for it to be subsumed into intrinsic oneness. So what would you say to that?
I'd have to think about that.
Okay, we'll think. Okay, thank you.
We have time for one more question. John? Thanks, Anna. That was really cool. And one of the things that it got me thinking about is, just from a more contemporary perspective, a lot of the ways that you were putting things sounded quite alien to me. So I was trying to, connect how, like when Plato and Aristotle are talking about whether a thing is one or many versus how I think about it. So I had two suggestions.
Please,
you probably heard these things before. One is that, at least from a contemporary perspective, I distinguish between the question of what the census of individuals is, and that's what the special composition question in part bears on. So how many individuals are we going to get at the end of the day? But then there's what I would take to be a very different question, which is for a given individual, which numerical properties sit on that individual? Is it a one? Is it a many? And I think that's a lot of what the stuff that's going on in Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
And there, I, from a contemporary perspective, have a bit of a rejection of a presupposition of that question. I think this is kind of a Phrygian idea. I don't think there are numerical properties. I think there are at best numerical relations. So asking whether something's a one or a many is a bit like asking, am I a father or a son? And the answer is, well, I'm a father relative to Ezra, and I'm a son relative to Benjamin, but it's a relational thing. So likewise, I am one relative to a certain unit of counting, organism, but I'm many relative to a different unit of counting, say organs, or I have a six-pack of beer. Is it one or many? Well, it's one as counted by 6 packs if you're in like the express line in the supermarket. It's many as counted by beers. But there's no numerical properties at all, but merely relations. So
yes, a quick response just to the last point, Jonathan, and thank you for both points. So I've thought about that as a potential way of rethinking about what I was saying, but being a father and being a son, you can be both a son and the father and the son in relation to different things, your parents and your son, respectively. But these senses of oneness I'm trying to bring into the picture are not things that something can both be.
I was thinking I was one in a sense and many in a sense, and that's many by my proper parts, or many by my organs, one by my biological integration into an organism. So can't I be both one and many? That's in fact a solution that Plato goes in for.
Yes. Yes, as a composite you can be one and many, but what about being one and one? So one by intrinsic criteria that make you one, and one by extrinsic criteria that make you one, namely your form and matter in Aristotelian terms.
I could be a one as counted by many different units.
And and that's where I want to say that whatever is counted as one by extrinsic criteria is not the extrinsic and the intrinsic cannot work as relative to something other. So the property being one by extrinsic oneness and the property being one by intrinsic oneness are not properties that can apply both to the same thing, because they are incompatible in a sense as two incompatible natures. Okay, more for later, yes.
Okay, so it's time for lunch, and we'll return in an hour. Let's thank Anna.
Thank you.